Lunch had long passed, leaving Daisy's diner in a strange lull, the in-between hours when time felt stretched, endlessly thin. Maya Wilson wiped the gleaming metal counter again and again, her movements automatic, like she was trying to scrub away reality. She had lost count of how many times she'd cleaned that counter today. Outside the large windows, gray clouds were gathering, hinting at a coming rainstorm that might wash away even the faint hope of a few late-day customers. Inside, the atmosphere was unusually still. Oldies from the kitchen radio drifted through the air like echoes from a distant time, so faint that you had to tilt your head just to make out the melody. "You can head out early if you want," called Frank, the burly cook, from the kitchen window, his deep voice tinged with sympathy. "It's deader out there than a graveyard." Maya gently shook her head, brushing a strand of chestnut hair from her cheek. "I can't afford to lose any more hours, Frank." What she didn't say was that her apartment was just as empty as the diner, silent, still. There, all that awaited her were stacks of overdue bills and a fragile hope that her next paycheck might be enough to cover both rent and utilities. She was 32 years old. This wasn't the life she had envisioned. Once, she'd dreamed of leaving this small town behind, of reaching for something bigger. But those dreams had crumbled when she dropped out of college and returned home with nothing but empty hands. And now, she was still here, in the very town she once swore she'd never look back on. "Suit yourself?" Frank shrugged and disappeared back into the kitchen. The clatter of pots and pans returned, mixing with the faint background tunes of a 60s love song. Maya's eyes scanned the diner, her little kingdom, for the next 4 hours. Only 2 customers remained. A trucker nursing a cold cup of coffee in the far corner, and Mrs. Henley, a kind widow who came every Wednesday for the meatloaf and always left exactly $7.25 as a tip. Not a penny more, not a penny less. The bell above the door chimed, breaking the stillness like a pebble dropped into a glass-smooth lake. Maya instinctively plastered on her professional smile. It was muscle memory by now. But her smile faltered when she turned and saw, not an adult, but a little girl standing alone in the doorway. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her hair was neatly braided into pigtails, and she wore a lemon-yellow raincoat, even though the sky hadn't opened up yet. Clutched tightly in her small hands was something indiscernible. Her wide, serious eyes scanned the room with a kind of focus that felt far too mature for her age, like someone who had seen more than a child should. "Hi there, sweetheart," Maya said gently as she approached, her voice as soft as morning mist. "Are you lost? Where's your mom or dad?" The little girl didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes swept the room as if searching for something. Then they stopped. Right at Maya's name tag, something shifted in her gaze. A flicker of recognition, or maybe relief. "You're Maya, right?" Her voice was quiet but certain, like a breeze before a storm. "Yes." "I am," Maya replied, her heart skipping a beat. A strange chill crept up her spine. "Do I know you?" The girl shook her head. Then, with quiet determination, she stepped forward and held out a crumpled envelope, likely clenched tightly in her hand for quite some time. "Daddy told me to give this to the nice lady with the smile that made the coffee taste better." Maya's breath caught. Only one person had ever said those exact words to her. Her hand trembled slightly as she accepted the envelope. "He said it's really important," the girl added. And just like that, like a sudden gust of wind, she turned and ran out the door before Maya could even react. "Wait!" Maya called after her, but it was too late. The bell above the door rang again, this time closing on something mysterious. Maya rushed to the entrance, pushing open the weathered wooden door, her eyes scanning the empty parking lot, but the girl was nowhere in sight. The only movement was a blue sedan slowly pulling away from the curb in the distance. Far too distant for Maya to recognize who was driving, or even if there was a passenger in the back seat. Her heart pounded, as if trying to tell her that something deeply significant had just brushed past her life. Quiet as a breath, but cutting deep. "What's going on?" Frank's voice came from behind her, warm and tinged with concern. He was drying his hands on an old apron, standing silently in the doorway, watching her with furrowed brows. I'm not sure," Maya murmured, gripping the white envelope, still warm from the girl's hands. No name, no markings, just a plain envelope, but one that seemed to hum with invisible weight. "A little girl came in and handed me this," she said shakily. Then she ran off before I could ask anything. Frank raised an eyebrow, half joking. Secret admirer? But Maya didn't laugh. Something about the encounter had shaken her. It felt like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air thickens and everything suddenly matters more. She returned to the counter slowly, fingertips brushing across the envelope's surface as though she could divine the message inside just by touch. "Aren't you going to open it?" Frank asked, his curiosity barely contained. Maya nodded slightly. She slipped a finger under the sealed flap, moving carefully, like the envelope held something fragile. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly, but before she could open it, something else slipped out. A photograph. A small, faded one, edges curled from time. She picked it up. In the photo, a man and a little girl, clearly the same one, sat on a park bench, both smiling, a full, radiant smile. But it was the man's face that made Maya freeze. "George!" she breathed, like uttering his name might bring him back. George Miller, the elderly man with silver hair and kind, tired eyes. The quiet regular who always sat alone at booth 9. For the last 8 months, he'd come in like clockwork, always ordering the same thing. Turkey club, no mayo, coleslaw, black coffee. Always in his weathered brown jacket, regardless of the weather. Always with a smile when she brought him an extra slice of pie that would have otherwise gone to waste. He had once told her he used to teach history at the local high school. He had been a widower. But never once did he mention children. Or a granddaughter. Maya unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky but warm, like the man himself. "Dear Maya, if you're reading this, then Emily has completed her very special mission." She was excited, though I made her promise to deliver it only if I wasn't around to do it myself. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes as the words unfolded like a final goodbye. I should have introduced her sooner, but there never seemed to be the right time. Emily is my granddaughter, though I've been her dad since she was 3, after her parents were taken in an accident. The doctors gave me 6 months last October. I've made it to 8, probably because I'm stubborn, but mostly because of 2 lights in my life: Emily's laughter and your kindness. The free refills, the pie you pretended was going to waste, the way you remembered my name. You probably thought it was nothing, but to me, facing the end, it meant everything. Maya sobbed softly. She remembered George fumbling for coins with trembling hands, and how she waved it off. She remembered bringing him a cupcake with 1 candle after he casually mentioned it was his birthday. She had thought it was a small gesture, but for George it had been a light in the darkness. You might think the things you did were small, like refilling my coffee or asking how my day was, but to a lonely old man preparing to leave this world, they were reminders that I still existed, that I still mattered. The paper was soaked with tears as Maya clutched the letter tightly, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the miracle that had just quietly slipped away forever. "I watched you, Maya. Not in a creepy way. I hope you don't misunderstand. I saw the exhaustion in your eyes, heard the worry in your voice when you mentioned rent or your broken car. You're always helping others, but never asking for help yourself. So I've left you something. Call it my final tip if you want. Under the loose floorboard beneath booth 9, you'll find something that now belongs to you. No strings attached, no conditions. It's money I saved over many years, not knowing what for. Until I met you." Maya felt her heart crack wide open. Once again, George, an elderly but deeply thoughtful man, had done something she never saw coming. Emily is taken care of now. My sister is her legal guardian, and she has her own education fund. What I've left for you is something I believe with all my heart that if anyone deserves it, it's you, Maya. Thank you for making my final days worth living. You were the only person who made me feel like I still belonged in this world, and for that, thank you. The words felt like whispers from beyond, brushing gently against the most tender corners of Maya's heart. She kept reading, each sentence like a delicate note falling into the unfinished symphony of a life that had quietly ended. If you ever have time someday, come visit me. I'll be where the light touches the creek in Millstone Park, right by the old oak tree. It was my favorite spot to read, and it's the place Emily chose as my resting place. Maya covered her mouth, unable to stop the tears from pouring down. The letter wasn't just a farewell. It was a final gift, as beautiful and compassionate as George himself. Please. Emily says you look like a princess. Her words, not mine. She also says you should smile more because there's magic in your happy face. I have to say, I agree with her. Maya's hands trembled. The thin paper fluttered slightly as if caught in a breeze, but there was no wind, only her own ragged breath. The simple handwriting carried the weight of mountains, pressing down on her chest, stealing the words from her throat. 3 weeks ago, George had come in for the last time. He'd looked more tired than usual that day, but still smiled at her. A warm, gentle smile, as if trying to leave something behind. If she had known it would be the last time, what would she have said? Would she have hugged him? Thanked him for always coming back? For trusting her? For being a quiet, steady presence in her life? Or would she have simply smiled again, one more time? What's going on, Maya? Frank's voice came, deep and concerned. Maya couldn't speak. She simply handed him the letter, eyes too clouded with tears to see his reaction as he read it. But she knew Frank would understand. Because George hadn't just left behind a letter. He had left something deeper. A touch on the soul. Slowly, Maya walked toward booth 9, where George had sat hundreds of times. It felt like an invisible thread was pulling her there. She slid into the old red vinyl seat and placed her hand on the worn tabletop where he had once rested his own. A hand that had taught history, held love, endured loss. Had he known on his last visit that he wouldn't return? Had that smile been his quiet goodbye? Sunlight streamed faintly through the windows, casting dust motes adrift in the air. Everything seemed to pause. The world had shrunk to just Maya, booth 9, and the memory of a man who had quietly walked out of it. The diner was silent, sacred even. This was where those fleeting conversations had taken place, those small interactions that, unbeknownst to either of them at the time, had pieced together into something lasting, something beautiful. Outside, the rain began to fall. The first drops struck the windows like gentle sobs, and within the tiny diner, with only the sound of rain, the hum of the refrigerator, and the shattering silence inside her heart, Maya let the grief come. She cried not just because George was gone, but because she had meant something to someone. More than she'd ever thought she could. Beneath the old floorboard under her feet, in the place where George had once sat, lay the final gift he had left her. A gift not just of money, but of belief, of love. A symbol of the fact that someone had seen her worth when the world had seemingly forgotten it. Maya sat there for what felt like hours, though the wall clock had barely ticked a few minutes. The letter remained open on the table. George's final words seemed etched into every cell of her body. Frank had returned to the kitchen, quiet as always, but Maya knew he was watching her from the service window, understanding without needing to ask. Some grief doesn't require words, only the space to be felt. She laid her hand gently on the tabletop where George's had once been, and the memories came like waves. George had first walked into Daisy's diner on a rainy October afternoon last year. Maya remembered it clearly. It had been her birthday. A day no one remembered. No one celebrated. She had been nearing the end of a 12-hour shift when the bell above the door chimed, and a silver-haired man in a worn brown coat stepped inside, eyes distant, a little lost. "Just one today?" Maya asked, her professional smile automatic. He nodded, gaze unfocused, as if searching for something long gone. She had seated him at booth 9, the quietest spot in the diner, by the window, but far from the draft. The booth reserved for those who preferred solitude. "What can I get you?" she asked, pen poised over her pad. George hadn't needed the menu. "Turkey club, no mayo, coleslaw, black coffee," he replied, his voice soft but clear. When she returned with his coffee, she noticed his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the cup. "Careful, it's hot," she said, gently, her voice warm, and in that moment, he looked up and really saw her. "Thank you," he said, and perhaps, in that simple moment, everything had begun. "You're very kind," George once told her. A sentence so simple it could have been forgotten among the noise of daily chatter, but for Maya, it became a quiet light on a lonely birthday. A day the world forgot her, except for one stranger with silver hair and kind eyes. After that day, George became a fixture at Daisy's, like the old clock on the wall, always there. 3 days a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, always between 2 and 3 p.m., during the quietest hours. Always booth 9, always the same order. And each time he arrived, Maya wasn't just serving. She was waiting. Gradually, their brief exchanges grew longer. George slowly revealed pieces of himself. He had taught history for 40 years. He loved 1950s jazz and once met Miles Davis at a small show in Chicago. His favorite book was To Kill a Mockingbird, which he reread every summer, a private ritual against the erosion of memory. Each detail, each soft laugh, helped build the portrait of a wise, gentle man carrying unspoken grief. Some days, his hands shook so much he couldn't hold his coffee. Maya never mentioned it, simply switched his mug to one with a thicker handle. When he dropped change, she'd help him retrieve it without a word, redirecting the conversation to the weather so he wouldn't feel embarrassed by the frailty creeping into his life. And then there were the bright days, when George's eyes sparkled with the mischief of a retired teacher recounting old pranks from his students. On one such day, he asked Maya about her dreams. When she shyly admitted that she once wanted to become a nurse but had to drop out due to life circumstances, George smiled and said, "You'd make a wonderful nurse, Maya. Not just because of how you do things, but because of how you see people and how you make them feel seen." She had laughed it off at the time, brushing away the emotion that welled up inside her. But that one sentence stayed with her, like a small flame warming her through the coldest, most hopeless days. She had never told George about the pressures she carried, the quiet breakdowns, and yet, somehow, he always seemed to know. Strangely, despite all those months of conversation, George never once mentioned Emily, the little girl with the solemn eyes and the trembling envelope. But Maya understood now, recalling his words from the letter. It never felt like the right time. She realized that there are parts of ourselves we keep, not out of distrust, but simply because we don't know how or when to share them. She found herself grieving, not just for George himself, but for all the parts of him she would never get to know. All the untold stories, the quiet twists of his life never voiced, the love he had for Emily, the granddaughter he called daughter with his whole heart, had been fiercely protected, held close until the very end. Maya folded the letter carefully and tucked it back with the photo of George and Emily. Then she stood, moving slowly. She knelt beside booth 9 and began feeling along the worn floorboards. Part of her felt silly, digging around for treasure beneath an old diner booth based on a single letter. But then her fingertips caught on something. A slightly raised board. Subtle, almost accidental, but unmistakably there. "Maya?" Frank called from the kitchen. "It's fine," she replied, steadier than she felt. "I just dropped something." Now wasn't the time. Customers were still around. Her shift wasn't over. Maya stood up, sliding the envelope into the pocket of her apron, a silent promise to the past that she would return. Beneath that floorboard, George had left behind one final piece of himself. A gift, an opportunity, no conditions, no expectations, just belief. The rest of her evening shift passed in a fog. Maya moved on autopilot, greeting customers, taking orders, delivering plates. But her mind circled booth 9. The letter. The unsaid stories. By 7 p.m., the diner had mostly emptied. It wasn't a dinner rush, just a trickle of customers, fading until the room grew quiet again. Maya started counting the minutes backward, anxious to return to booth 9, where something extraordinary was waiting. When Frank reminded her that he was heading out for the night and that she'd be the one to lock up as they had agreed, Maya felt an odd sense of relief, like a pressure valve releasing after a long build-up. "You sure you're all right?" Frank paused at the door, deep lines of age creased further by genuine concern. "You've been somewhere else ever since that little girl came in." Maya forced a small smile. "I'm fine, just tired." And it wasn't a complete lie. She was tired, down to her bones. But not the kind of tired that comes from working an 8-hour shift. This was exhaustion born from emotional upheaval, a storm of the soul. George's letter had shaken her deeply. Beneath that weariness, however, was a strange energy thrumming through her, nervous, wired, the kind of jittery buzz that made her hands tremble, just like George's had on his worst days. Frank gave her a nod, though his eyes still held uncertainty. "Don't forget to set the alarm." Once his pickup disappeared into the shadows beneath the streetlights, Maya flipped the sign to close and drew the blinds. The fluorescent lights hummed in the sudden silence, casting a harsh glow over the empty diner. Everything felt cold, sterile. She should clean, count the register, wipe down the tables. But her feet took her in one direction only, back to booth 9. It wasn't just a seat anymore. It was a doorway to something deeper. This time, there was no hesitation. She knelt again and felt along the floor. Near the wall, she found it. A board that dipped slightly under pressure. Maya pressed harder, slipped her fingernail between the cracks, and pried it up. Underneath was a small hollow, just big enough to hide something meaningful. And there it was, just as George had promised, a thick manila envelope sealed with clear packing tape. On the front, written in careful block letters, were the words, "Final tip." Maya's hands shook as she lifted it. It was heavier than expected. Firm, definite. It held something important. Not photos, not papers, but something that carried real weight. A flicker of doubt passed through her. What if it was something illegal? What if this was all an elaborate joke? But no. George had never been that kind of man. Not once. His every word, every glance had been real, rooted in kindness, sincerity, and wisdom. Maya took a deep breath and carried the envelope to the counter. With scissors from the register drawer, she carefully sliced through the tape. What spilled out made her gasp. Cash. Thick stacks of it. Neatly bundled $100 0-cent bills, secured with rubber bands. It looked like something out of a movie, but it was real. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the bills. She half expected them to vanish the moment she touched them, but they didn't. The crisp edges and weight confirmed it. There was something else inside, too. A folded note placed gently atop the stacks. She opened it with shaking hands. "You're probably surprised, maybe even suspicious, but I want you to know, This money is clean. I saved it, year after year. Long before I ever met you, my pension covered my needs. This was for some future emergency. But as my future grew shorter, the money lost its purpose. Until I met you. There's $25,000. 0 cents here. Not a fortune, I know, but enough to make a difference. Out for nursing school, or a down payment on a small home, or just a cushion for when life inevitably throws its punches. Use it well, use it to find joy. That's all I ask. $25,000, 0 cents. Maya collapsed onto the stool behind the counter, knees too weak to hold her. The number echoed in her mind like a pinball, ricocheting off every part of her life it could transform. Car repairs, her mother's medical bills, tuition for the nursing program she thought she'd never afford. A new apartment without mold in the bathroom. For a moment, the world seemed to open, bright and full of possibility, and then came the guilt. She couldn't accept it. It was too much, too generous. A gift from someone who, in the grand scheme of things, had only been a customer. George was kind, yes, but $25,000, 0 cents, wasn't kindness. It was life-changing. What would people say? What would his family think? Did his sister, the one now caring for Emily, even know this money existed? What if they needed it more? Maya carefully gathered the stacks and returned them to the envelope, sealing it once more. A new storm raged in her chest, not sorrow, but conflict, doubt, fear. George had left her a gift, or more accurately, a responsibility, not just out of kindness, but because he truly believed. She would know what to do with it, and now Maya had a decision to make. Would she use the money as a kind of miracle to change her life, or would she return it to George's family, those bound to him by blood? Those who had loved him too, though in a different way. Maya needed time, not just to think, but to truly understand what George had entrusted to her. She gently replaced the floorboard, hiding the manila envelope, like a sacred relic pressed close to her heart, then moved on to closing duties in a daze, like someone walking through a dream. Outside, night had wrapped itself around the small street. The cool air brushed against her flushed cheeks, a reminder that the world kept turning despite the emotional storm surging inside her. A distant siren wailed. Leaves rustled in the breeze. Everything felt normal. Except for Maya. She sat still in her car, engine off. The envelope sat in her bag, heavy as a stone. Or maybe a lifeline. $25,000, 0 cents. A sum that was both a treasure and a test. Not enough to change the whole world, but maybe just enough to change hers. Was it George's final tip? Or his final test? The question circled her mind like a sad, looping song. Could she accept this gift without feeling like she was somehow taking advantage of a dying man's gratitude, just for being kind in moments where kindness had cost her nothing? Eventually, Maya turned the key. The sputtering rattle of the engine was a harsh reminder of her financial reality, a world of bills, debts, and long-postponed dreams. That night, Maya barely slept. The envelope sat untouched on her small kitchen table, its presence crowding the apartment like an uninvited guest. She made tea, but didn't drink it, turned on the TV and muted it moments later. She paced the worn carpet until the neighbor downstairs banged on the ceiling in protest. When sleep finally claimed her near dawn, her dreams came jumbled and restless. George's face, Emily's solemn eyes, stacks of money that turned into autumn leaves the moment she tried to touch them. Morning light filtered weakly through her thin curtains, but the questions from the night before remained. They circled her like hungry wolves. Do I deserve this money? Did I really make that much of a difference in George's life? And what about Emily? Shouldn't the money go to her? Maya stepped into the shower, letting the hot water run down her body as if it could rinse away the conflict. but the doubts clung to her like steam on glass. As she dressed for her shift, her eyes landed on the only framed photo in the room, an old picture of a younger Maya sitting beside a hospital bed, her arm wrapped around a thin man who still managed a radiant smile. Her father, 3 months before cancer took him. The memories came rushing back. Antiseptic-scented hallways, the steady beep of monitors, and the crushing weight of walking into the room 15 minutes too late. Her father had already gone. That guilt had never truly left. It only changed form, sometimes a sigh, sometimes a silent dream. She remembered the cold expressions of the nurses that day, how most treated her father like just another patient, another chart, except one, Angela. A nurse with warm eyes and gentle hands. She had learned her father's name, asked about his life, and listened, even if only for a few fleeting minutes. She made her father feel seen, respected, human, even when his body had stopped being his own. It was in that moment Maya had promised herself she would become a nurse, someone like Angela. But then life happened. Her mother got sick. The bills piled up. Her nursing courses were postponed, then abandoned. The dream faded, but never fully died. It had only been sleeping, like a seed waiting for sunlight. Maybe this money was the light. The thought stopped Maya mid-motion. Her hands trembled as she buttoned her uniform, but her mind, strangely, felt clear. George had died, just like her father. But unlike the nurses who had ignored her dad, Maya had seen George. She had heard him, smiled at him, shown kindness, not out of obligation, but because that's who she was. She hadn't known he was sick. She hadn't known about Emily. She hadn't known he was dying. But she had treated him with warmth, with sincerity. And to George, that had been enough to change his final days. Did I really help him that much? She whispered to her reflection. There was no reply, but in the photo her father's eyes seemed to echo an answer. Sometimes, just being seen is everything. Maya arrived at the diner 20 minutes early. The manila envelope was still in her bag. She didn't know why she'd brought it. Maybe because today she finally knew what she was going to do. She couldn't leave it behind in her empty apartment. Maybe because everything connected to it still felt too surreal, too big for the small world she lived in, as if it might disappear unless she kept it close. The envelope had become something she couldn't let go of, not even subconsciously. Instead of heading to the floor like usual, she walked straight into the kitchen. Frank looked up, surprised to see her this early, especially in the middle of kneading dough for the morning's biscuits. "You're early," he observed, his hands rhythmically folding flour. "Something wrong?" "Frank," Maya began, then paused. How much of this could she actually say out loud? How much of it was too private? "Did you ever notice anything off about George? The older guy who always sat at booth 9? Frank's hands stilled, flour dusting his arms like fine snow. "George Miller? Quiet guy, turkey club, no mayo. Black coffee. Yeah, I remember him." Maya nodded. "Did he seem okay to you?" Frank thought for a moment. "Nothing obvious, but toward the end he looked rough, thinner, pale. I figured he was sick. Most of our regulars are getting up there in age. You notice it. If you're paying attention." Maya looked down at her hands. "Did you know he had a granddaughter?" Frank shook his head. "Never mentioned family to me, but he never really talked much to me either. He liked talking to you, always lit up when you were on shift." That simple statement hit Maya like a punch to the chest. George lit up? Because of her. Could her presence really have meant that much? "That letter yesterday," Frank said, turning back to the dough but still watching her. "That was from him, wasn't it?" Maya nodded slowly. "He passed away, Frank. The little girl from yesterday. She's his granddaughter. Her parents died in an accident. George raised her." Frank's weathered face softened. "Damn, poor kid." He looked at Maya more carefully now. "And there was more in that letter, wasn't there? Something that shook you? Maya hesitated before softly admitting, "He left me something. A gift. A big one. And I don't know if I should take it." Frank didn't ask for details, and that more than anything made Maya feel grateful. "Did he want you to have it?" he asked. "Yes, but—" Frank shook his head, cutting her off with a gentle but firm tone. "No buts, Maya. If a man gives you something before he dies, it's because he wants you to have it. So take it. It's that simple." But Maya knew it wasn't simple. Nothing about this situation was simple. What if the money was supposed to go to Emily? What if his family needs it more than I do? Frank shrugged. "From what you've told me, sounds like George made his choice. He had his reasons. I've been in this business a long time, seen a lot of people. George picked you for something real. Trust that." As Maya tied her apron and got ready for another workday, a storm of doubt still churned inside her. But amidst the whirlwind, something small was starting to shift, a tiny seed of acceptance, pushing its way through the heavy soil of guilt and uncertainty. 3 days passed. The manila envelope remained tucked in a drawer beneath sweaters she rarely wore. She had counted the money once, exactly $25,000, 0 cents, just as George had written. Since then, she hadn't touched it, hadn't spent a dime. But she also couldn't bring herself to return it. On her day off, Maya woke early. George's letter still sat on her nightstand, its creases worn soft from how many times she'd read it. She didn't need to look anymore to remember the words. "You were the only person who made me feel like I still belonged in this world. If you ever have time, come visit me. I'll be where the light touches the creek in Millstone Park." And just like that, the decision formed within her, quiet and clear, like morning light. No more doubt, no more hesitation. Maya knew what she had to do. Not to ask permission, not to justify herself, but to visit the man who had seen her, believed in her, and left behind a gift that could only be answered with action. Today, she would visit George. She couldn't put it off any longer. His words echoed in her mind, leading her not just to a place of remembrance, but perhaps to a place of peace, of affirmation, or maybe even forgiveness. She dressed simply, jeans and a worn blue sweater, the color that felt most connected to memory. In her jacket pocket, she carefully tucked the photo of George and Emily, as if carrying a piece of the past with her on this quiet journey. Millstone Park sat on the outskirts of town, a vast green space cut through by a winding creek that curved like a soft ribbon. She hadn't been there in years. The last time was for a holiday fireworks show, or maybe one of the rare picnics back when her father was still alive, when family was still a whole thing. Today was Thursday, a calm spring morning. The park was nearly empty. Maya followed the creek, unsure exactly what she was searching for. George had written, "Where the light touches the creek." A vague direction, but sometimes the vaguest paths lead to the most honest places. After nearly an hour of wandering, just as she was about to give up, she saw it. An old oak tree stood tall on a small rise beside the water, its enormous branches forming a natural canopy overhead. Morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting golden patches on the widening curve of the creek. The light danced on the water's surface like strands of gold ribbon, and there beneath the oak's shade was a simple granite headstone. Maya slowed her steps, heart thudding in her chest like each footfall brought her closer to something sacred. The stone was plain, nothing elaborate, just a name, George Edward Miller, with birth and death years. Below that, a short line, "The teacher to the end. He's picked that himself," said a small voice behind her. Maya turned quickly. Emily was standing there, not in her yellow raincoat, but in a pale yellow dress, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. The sunlight caught her brown hair and made it glow like honey. "Emily," Maya breathed. I didn't expect to see you here. The girl nodded, stepping forward to place the flowers carefully at the foot of the grave. I'd come every Thursday. It was our special day. We used to get ice cream after school and then come to the park to read. She glanced up at Maya. Daddy said you'd come eventually. He just didn't know when. Really said that? Maya asked softly, surprised. Emily nodded. He said you were kind, but also kind of stubborn, that sometimes good people need to see things for themselves before they can believe they're worthy. There was something in the way Emily spoke, calm, measured, far older than her years, that made Maya's skin prickle. The girl was small, but her words carried a strange maturity, like she had been forced to carry too much, too early. Maya knelt down, bringing herself to eye level. Your daddy was a very special person. Emily's expression softened. He was the best daddy. Not my first daddy. He died when I was really little. I don't remember him much. But George, he was my daddy in all the best ways. He taught me how to read. He made pancakes shaped like animals. He told me stories about my grandma. I never met her. Maya's throat tightened. I'm sorry you lost him. Emily shrugged in the way children do when they've already learned to accept the things they cannot change. He was really sick. He said it was better to say goodbye the right way than to just disappear. She paused, then asked, Did you get his gift? Maya didn't speak, just nodded. And he was afraid you wouldn't take it. He said, maybe you'd feel like you didn't deserve it, but he wanted you to have it. He said you deserved it more than anyone. Maya whispered, But I didn't do anything special. Emily looked at her like she didn't understand how Maya could be so wrong. You made him happy. When he was sad, when he was hurting, you made him smile. He said you were like sunlight in the dark. The diner's not that dark, Maya said, trying to smile. Not the diner, Emily said, with a patient sigh beyond her years. The sad place inside his heart. After my grandma died, and then my first parents. He didn't smile anymore. But when he started going to your diner, he came home different. Lighter. Happier. She picked at a blade of grass, twisting it between her fingers. Nick said you reminded him of her. And Emily looked down. He said he wished you were my mom. Maya felt the air leave her lungs. Her heart flipped in her chest. What? She whispered. Emily nodded, not meeting Maya's eyes. He said, if things had been different, if he were younger, or if he'd met you earlier, you would have been the perfect mom. Because you're kind and beautiful and strong. She looked up, her voice soft but unwavering. He said, I should grow up to be like you. Tears welled in Maya's eyes, spilling over in quiet streams she didn't try to stop. Not just for George's words, but for the child standing before her. A living reminder of love, of loss, and of the quiet miracles that simple kindness can bring. They sat together in silence. Beneath the wide canopy of the ancient oak, sunlight filtered through like golden fragments, dancing across the water's surface. The creek murmured softly nearby. A young woman and a child, both carrying their own ache, sharing a sacred moment of understanding, grief, and fragile hope. Maya couldn't help but wonder, if she had met George earlier, at a different time in her life, what could have been? Could they have formed a small, unconventional family, her George and Emily with those wise, weathered eyes? It felt like a dream spun from longing, sweet and impossible, but her heart ached with the beauty of it. My aunt is waiting in the car, Emily said after a while, standing and brushing grass from her dress. She lets me come alone because this was our place, me and Daddy, but she still worries. Maya stood too and nodded gently. I understand. Thank you for letting me see you today, Emily. The girl started down the path, then paused and turned back. Daddy wanted you to be happy, you know. That's why he gave you the money, because he believed you deserved the chance to follow your dreams. The words struck Maya like a gong in her chest. She stood there long after Emily had walked away, her hand resting on the cool stone of George's grave. The creek burbled beside her, and sunlight danced on the rippling water as if offering its own quiet blessing. "Thank you," Maya whispered. She wasn't sure who she was speaking to, George, Emily, or fate itself, which had so intricately woven their lives together. 6 months later, Daisy's diner had changed. Customers who hadn't visited in a while often blinked in surprise as they walked in. The old faded curtains had been replaced. The scuffed countertop now gleamed with a new coat of polish. The wheezing, ancient coffee machine had been swapped out for a sleek modern one. The red vinyl booths, once torn and tired, now shone like new. But the most noticeable transformation was Booth 9. It sat slightly apart from the others, like a quiet shrine in the hum of the diner. Its red leather cushions gleamed under soft, golden lights. Above it hung a small brass plaque, in memory of George Miller, a quiet man who reminded us to be kind. Every morning, fresh daisies, his favorite, were placed on the table. They were never forgotten behind the counter. Maya wiped down the bar, her movements practiced and precise. But her uniform had changed. She now wore navy blue scrubs, the unmistakable sign of a nursing student. Her server's apron tied loosely over them during the few shifts she still worked at the diner. The bell above the door jingled. Maya looked up. It was Emily, now taller, lighter in spirit, and always accompanied by her Aunt Sharon. From that first visit in the park, Emily had become a regular weekend customer, usually arriving for Saturday lunch. They always sat at booth 7, just close enough to booth 9. Emily had decided that booth 9 should be saved for people who need a little extra kindness. "Hi, Maya," Emily called out cheerfully, her voice softer, her smile brighter. "Guess what? I got an A on my history presentation." "That's wonderful." Maya smiled, already reaching for a tall milkshake glass. Emily's usual order, chocolate milkshake and crispy chicken fingers. A silent nod to afternoons once shared with George. "She worked really hard on it," Sharon added, settling into their familiar booth. She glanced over at booth 9, her eyes catching the warm glow from the brass plaque. She didn't say anything more, but Maya knew. She understood everything. As Maya prepared their drinks, she scanned the rest of the diner. A few regulars remained, Mrs. Henley with her ever-present crossword, Bill, the retired mail carrier with his newspaper and slowly savored cup of coffee, and a newer, familiar face, Sandra. The young mother sat quietly in the corner, her infant asleep in a stroller beside her. Sandra had shown up 2 months ago, her eyes swollen from crying, clutching her newborn and an empty wallet. Her husband had walked out. Maya had served her a full breakfast that first morning, on the house, and again the days that followed, until, one quiet afternoon, Maya had sat across from her and said gently, "I can tell things are hard right now. I've been there." And later, with more confidence, "How would you feel about working here a few mornings a week? Frank could use some help in the kitchen. We can work around your kids' school schedule." The look of gratitude in Sandra's eyes had been all the confirmation Maya needed, that she was using George's gift exactly as he'd hoped. She no longer saw the money as payment for a few kind gestures, nor as a strange inheritance from a regular customer. To Maya, it had become a gift meant to be shared. Some of it had gone toward refurbishing Daisy's diner, breathing new life into its tired walls. Some had gone to tuition, reviving the nursing dream Maya had buried long ago. Another portion had seeded the George Miller Memorial Scholarship, created to help local students pursue careers in education or healthcare, and a portion still remained, set aside not for herself, but for others like George, people quietly bearing their pain, just waiting for someone to notice. Maya placed the tall glass in front of Emily with a warm grin. "Palm chocolate milkshake for my favorite history expert," she said, tousling the girl's hair. "And coffee for Aunt Sharon," Emily added, her eyes sparkling like sunlight through trees. "Will you still work here once you become a nurse?" the girl asked softly. "Daddy always said your smile made the coffee taste better." The ache in Maya's chest flared gently at the mention of George. Not sharp anymore, just a warm sting of remembrance. She nodded. "I think I will. This place means a lot to me." "Because of my daddy?" Emily asked. Maya looked at her, her expression tender. "Because of many things. But yes, your daddy is one of them." That afternoon, after the lunch rush had ebbed and the diner quieted, Maya once again found herself drawn to booth 9, the place that would always hold a piece of her. She slid into the seat and rested her fingertips on the plaque. "In memory of George Miller, a quiet man who reminded us to be kind." She closed her eyes and for a moment let his voice echo in her memory, steady, gentle, and full of grace. "He was right," she whispered into the quiet. "That gift, it changed more than just the balance in my bank account." When George tucked that envelope beneath the floorboard all those months ago, he probably couldn't have predicted everything that would follow. That because of it, Sandra now had a steady job and a confident smile again. That Frank, with his arthritic hands, no longer winced every time he cooked thanks to a new kitchen. That students in this small town would have a better shot at careers in nursing or teaching, just like George once did. Maybe George didn't need to know all of that. Maybe all he needed to believe was this: kindness, when planted at the right moment, creates ripples of its own. Like a stone dropped into still water, it sends waves outward, touching shores we never could have imagined. The bell above the door jingled. Maya stood up. A young couple walked in, nervous, unfamiliar. They hesitated near the entrance, wearing the unsure expressions of people new to town. "Welcome to Daisy's." Maya greeted them warmly, that practiced, comforting smile blooming on her face. She held 2 menus in hand. "Table for 2? The woman asked, visibly relaxing at Maya's tone. "Right this way." Maya led them to booth 9. As they sat, she placed the menus in front of them with gentle efficiency. "First time here? We just moved in yesterday," the man explained. "Well then, you've come to the right place." Maya smiled. "This booth is special. It's reserved for people who could use a little extra kindness today." As she stepped away to fetch their drinks, moving through the diner with the ease of long habit, Maya no longer felt George as a ghost lingering in memory. He was no longer just a story from her past. He was present, in this moment, in this space, in the way she saw people, in the way she listened, in the grateful eyes of a young mother, in the bright smile of a little girl who had once known deep loss. That final tip, George's gift, could never be measured in money, but its value was eternal, a lesson in kindness, because every life, no matter how small, touches another. And sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness leave the longest shadows.